My name is Rich Ivory, and I, as chair of the Department of Psychology, want to welcome you all today to our 2012 faculty lecture. I'm glad you joined us. It's that most beautiful day on campus. That was really amazing to walk across today and think about being part of this place. I want to start by first thanking our organizing committee for the faculty lecture series. It includes our two Irvs, Irv Hafter and Irv Zucker, Joe Campos, and Rona Weinstein. Our department has a long and rich history, but keeping track of that history is difficult. There's an interesting ongoing project this semester that's spearheaded by Peter Gillette, one of our recent PhDs. Peter's teaching the history of psychology class this term, and he's developed a really interesting project, our final project for the students. They're out there interviewing our faculty, both current and emeriti, and asking them to sort of recount their lineage as well as their observations on the major changes in our field. I participated in this last night. I don't fathom myself a historical figure, but it did make salient that because of the relative youth of psychology, we're all just a few degrees of separation from the masters. I look forward to seeing the products of this project there. I assume will become part of the department archives and maybe someday appear on the web. Now, I see our faculty lecture series as another vehicle for recording our history and recognizing the important contributions that have been made to the psychological sciences by members of our department. These lectures are always given by the emeriti from our department, and they provide an opportunity for us to hear a mature story, the ideas and stories that have formed a career. The lectures are really an important part of the fabric of the department, helping provide the threads that form our intellectual community. The first faculty lecture was delivered by Richard Lazarus in 1989. We did have people retire before then, but we didn't have a lecture series. I actually couldn't tell you about that lecture. It occurred a few years before I got to Berkeley. But I have seen many since, including two lectures in 1992, one by Russ Develoy and a second by Sue Irvin Tripp. More recently, we heard Irv Hafter speak on the wonders of the auditory system. Dan Slobin gave a feisty lecture on thinking for speaking. Steve Glickman took us on a trip to the zoo. And Irv Zucker, in his iconoclastic way, refused to participate in a retrospective seminar and chose instead to break new ground in considering the cost of ignoring or restricting gender in subject selection. And then we had the wonderful evening last year in which Tom Wickens provided us his views on the powers and pitfalls of using models to understand psychological processes. So to introduce this year's speaker, Marty Covington, I'm going to turn the podium over to Rona, who's going to do the introduction today. So thanks for joining us.
It's a great delight to welcome you to our distinguished faculty lecture series. I thank the committee and Rich and Francis Katsura for creating such a wonderful event for our department. I'm deeply honored to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Martin Covington. You might say that Marty and I have been tied at the hip during our entire time at Berkeley. We formed a group of two. You could call us Group 4, hearkening back to the old but not good days. That's an inside joke. We have been loyal outliers in the department, with our minds and hearts linked to the study of psychology in educational settings, the social and individual factors that shape motivation and achievement, and the classroom and institutional changes that promote greater engagement in learning. Over the years, we tore down the corridor floors leading to the School of Education to serve on endless student committees. We co-taught a memorable evening seminar on school reform, composed of practitioners and graduate students, with young elementary school students invited in as our informants after a meal at McDonald's. This was one step in our intensive preparation for a national grant competition to design, implement, and evaluate a new school built on our research findings, and to scale it up across the country in replications. Happily for our health and our marriages, we were not awarded said grant, which wore out a number of the winners, as we were to discover, including a death, sadly. Marty and I also share a love of art. I have terrific memories of a lesson he gave me in acrylic painting in his study studio, a glorious room that has sections devoted to his broad range of interests: academic work, painting, photography, his collections, and magic. Finally, as I travel the world to conferences and folks see Berkeley on my name tag, I'm always asked, "Do you know Marty Covington?" And when I say yes, my hand is shook in reverence for my good luck to share the same department as he does. Marty joined the faculty in psychology in 1964, almost 50 years ago. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Redlands and his PhD from Berkeley School of Education in educational psychology. He's been honored both for his research and teaching. Among the awards received, the University Distinguished Teaching Award, the Berkeley Faculty Award for Outstanding Membership of GSIs, and the first holder of the Berkeley Presidential Chair in Undergraduate Education. Marty's research program has been translational from the start. As examples, first, exploring the components of and teaching for creative problem solving. 2, explicating the self-defeating dynamics of failing to try, that effort is a double-edged sword in order to preserve one's self-worth in the classroom. And third, nurturing intrinsic motivation in large enrollment university classes. His books, Self-Worth in School Learning, Making the Grade, The Will to Learn, have become classics in the field and are known worldwide. His work has focused our attention on the crisis of motivation in education, a striving which is undermined when we turn learning into an ability game. Marty's laboratory has always been the college classroom. As a dynamic instructor of an introductory psychology, he has tested theories about motivation through experiments in instructional innovations. This creative and systematic work has resulted in an enormous data bank on student learning within varying educational contexts, which has provided cohorts of excited graduate students the opportunity to study and to influence motivation. Translation of instructional theory and empirical research into practice has been the hallmark of his efforts. First, to train our own graduate students to teach Psychology 1. They were first supported as GSIs and then mentored in teaching their own courses. And second, moving beyond our department with the presidential chair to train faculty and GSIs from now more than 36 departments across the university in revitalizing their large lecture courses to awaken intrinsic motivation in students. Not surprisingly, perhaps, the man who studies intrinsic motivation has always lived a life of internally driven creative process himself, ever growing, not only in his research, but also in his photography, painting, and his work as a magician. Quote, "Magic teaches us to see," Marty has been quoted as saying, "and true magic never leaves us feeling the same," end of quote. So it can be said for productive learning in any domain. Let us warmly welcome Marty, whose talk today is entitled Self-Worth Theory, the Vital Throbbing Center of Achievement Motivation. Marty.
Thank you, Rona. Wonderful, handsome introduction. And thanks to the committee as well. And welcome to everyone here. Friends, relatives, former students, colleagues, and hangers-on. Probably the best way to start would be to quote one of the gurus of our time, in terms of wisdom, Albert Einstein. With a twinkle in his eye, I'm sure, he said, "The world is not made up of atoms, it's made up of stories." And so here is a story. It's almost exclusively biographical, involving thousands of Berkeley undergraduates, dozens of dissertation students, and also over 200 GSIs, or graduate student instructors. But there are some autobiographical elements as well. And so let's start with those. I was born. It was the best of times. Now, in order to compress time and move forward and to avoid any implication of excessive narcissism, let's fast forward in warp speed 20 years later in time, not more than 200 yards from here, in the Life Science Building, a group of excited first-year graduate students in psychology arranged themselves around for an organizational meeting. And now, 53 years later, 200 yards from the Life Science Building, we find ourselves again. I think that's the ultimate definition of job security. Okay, fast forward again. Past those years in graduate school, training, past the point of joining the faculty of the psychology department, and then on to the tenure step, which was successfully crossed. And now we come to the end of the beginning of the story for today. Just after tenure, and those years before, my beloved mentor, Richard Crutchfield, and I, as co-investigators for the Carnegie Corporation of New York, developed some school-based materials to teach young children, primarily upper elementary school age, the strategies and skills of problem solving and thinking and creative functioning. And there was a commercial version of that, successful, the Productive Thinking Program. And I'm happy to say that one of the original co-authors of that program is here today, Bob Olton, who many of you will recognize as a former member of the department. And I know we'll want to renew acquaintances with Bob at the reception. Bob, do you want to raise your hand? Great, good. Now, Bob can attest to the fact that we were very successful in creating skill sets for these youngsters, which were very effective for them in the area of problem solving and thinking. Such things as the creation of strategies, planning, creating ideas, testing ideas, and the like. But what was curious to me, and again, the gateway to the rest of today, was the fact that while these youngsters on command in a testing situation could actually produce those strategies and do very well, but in spontaneous situations where that demand was not there, there was very little evidence of those newly won strategies and skills. There was something missing. I began to think of it in terms of a single word, motivation, and what we as adults would generally morph into a larger context, the will to learn, the ability to be surprised, to wonder, to sense the extraordinary in the ordinary, or the possible in the nearly impossible, a seeking for knowledge for its own sake. Those things seem not to have any kind of additional traction because of skill training. And so, as I began to wonder about that, it was very clear to me as an educational psychologist that much of the purpose and mission of school should be the fostering of the will to learn and the love of learning, the appreciation for these process of learning, and also the appreciation for those who've gone before us in learning and creating of knowledge. But alas, as we all know to some great extent, these kinds of missions and values tend to be honored more in the breach than in the observance. And so with these kinds of thoughts in mind, an idea came to mind that really set the stage and guided me and my colleagues for the next 40 years. And the question was, if we rearrange the learning experiences of students along motivational lines and goals, such things as the promotion of the will to learn or seeking information for its own sake, then what would schooling look like? And would it make a difference? And so that was indeed the beginning. But if you're going to invoke motivational principles, you certainly are going to need some guidance, because those will guide you in all of your research. And so I began to look around for theories of motivation for teaching and learning that also had a developmental quality to them, something that would give us a chance to create a larger educational policy that would transcend age, starting with preschool and going to graduate school. Wow, what an ambitious undertaking that was. But of course, if I'd known then that there were still 40 years ahead that we could accomplish that, we might have actually tried to take over not only this planet, but the universe as well. But nonetheless, without a theory around, there was a void. Something had to fill in. Despite the fact that, using the terminology of Ernest Becker, I found nothing in the field but a kaleidoscope of basically unrelated facts, common sense ideas strewn all over the place, and the lament, sadly from Becker's point of view, there was no vital, throbbing center. What might that center be like? A crucial choice. And we'll see as we go along whether it in fact was a good choice. And so I chose a concept that predated scientific psychology by centuries, known to all of us: the self, and by extension, self-worth. Now, what would be a quick and rapid way to summarize and give a sense for what that extension to self-worth really means? And so I quote from Oscar Hammerstein: "The biggest and truest and most significant line in all nursery rhymes is a line in Little Jack Corner. What a good boy am I. That is what everybody wants to say to himself, but he can have little assurance of his beliefs unless he is endorsed by other members of his group. Everyone has a desire for approval." And so the notion is that we all struggle, an epic struggle, to create a sense of self-acceptance based on the kinds of things that we can deliver to ourselves, and an acceptance by our group when we provide things of significance and value to them. So what are some of the elements of this self-worth theory? Well, first of all, the animating force of that theory is fear. The fear of failure. That is, failure implicating the individual as incompetent or unable to create something of value. So one is only as valuable and as worthy as the ability to create valuable activities or products or outcomes for one another. So ability seems to be the whole center of this piece. And of course, it turns out, as we all know from a lot of research, not only that generated by ourselves, but others, that the idea of ability and a preoccupation with ability starts very young. And to our surprise, magnifies through time so that with our data generated from college samples, we find that more often than not, when push comes to shove, undergraduates prefer to be seen with a reputation of brilliance as opposed to a high GPA. Surprising. So, how does success and failure, ability, worth, all come together in a kind of dynamic sense into a process? Well, to answer that, we can thank my colleague, Richard Beery, who, when I first met him in the very early days of work, was a counselor in the counseling center at the counseling center here at Berkeley. He worked with students having stress in achievement. Now, this is not his thumbprint, nor a cloud chamber, part of this apparatus. And I might advocate that, or comment that this particularly archaic machine is used to celebrate the fact that we're way back in time, historically. Its real virtue, other than being able to take fingerprints, it works. All right. Performance equals or tells us about ability, hence our worth. Now let's consider that formula from the point of view of failure. And we need to pause a moment to say something here about failure, because we're not talking about, for the most part, catastrophic failure or administrative failure, where someone is asked to leave the university or is put on probation or loses scholarships. It's a much more subtle but still very corrosive kind of event. We can define failure psychologically as those cases in which one's performance falls below their aspirations. And so for such things to the outsider that seem so trivial, so remote from significance, as failing to get an A and only receiving a B+, those can be devastating kinds of failures. And so we'll tend to be in those kinds of realms in our conversation. So, performance, in this case failure, in testing or a failure for a grade, even a final grade, indicates that one is not capable, is unable to perform to the levels that others or they themselves as an individual would require, hence unworthiness. So how does that apply to schools? Well, schools, as we generally know, are often arranged around competitive policies. I think my colleague Rona said it best, when schools become arranged as ability games. And in that context of competition, there are almost invariably more losers than winners. And so since worthlessness is intolerable, then self-protective mechanisms must come into play. And here's how Beery would say it. We cut the connection between P and A by saying, my poor performance does not reflect on my ability. It's caused by something else, hence I am not unworthy. And we're all familiar with those kinds of strategies, being teachers ourselves, and have many students who are prone to this. Let's take just one for sake of simplicity and time as a strategy, one that almost 95 to 100% of undergraduates, when queried about this, claim to have one time or another been procrastinators. So in procrastination, one does have an explanation for failure that's not threatening, immediately at least. That is, if I'd only had more time to study, I would have succeeded. Now, the implication here, of course, is when this happens too often, too much, in situations that are not particularly plausible or credible in supporting that particular excuse, then one creates the very failures they're attempting to avoid. So there's a downward slope with regard to that. So these strategies we might want to call failure with honor, for any other term. Okay. Well, one experiment, one of the first ones we started many years ago now, really says all of this in numbers and picks up on all of these arguments that we have just made. All right. This may be a little too much of a test for acuity in the back, so we will simply say that on this vertical axis, negativity of reaction, we have least to most, that is, we'll say in a moment, least sense of shame to great shame, or least suspicions of inability to considerable suspicions at the top. And we have certain conditions of failure here. So here's what we ask students to do, 400 Berkeley undergraduates, to imagine a time in a course when they took an examination in which they felt they had failed and the remainder of the group had done quite well. And so we ask them to then rate the degree to which they felt both shame and incompetency under these 4 conditions of failure. Now, for simplicity's sake, I've simply combined the shame and the inability because shame follows immediately from inability. The two are highly correlated, which supports the self-worth theory. Well, we first find that judgments of incompetency depend on effort levels. Let's take effort level E+, which means trying hard, studying hard, and failing anyway. You can see a considerable elevation here in terms of feeling that one is unable, and also for that shame. And by the way, shame is the emotional component of worth, given the research that we have done. Now, that occurs, of course, because of sort of a multiple hypothesis notion that failure can occur at least for 2 reasons. One, low effort, and one, low ability. But if you take low effort off the table by providing lots of effort, then the implication goes to low ability. Over here, where one does not try, then there's a considerable reduction in both shame and a sense of inability or incompetency. Now let's move to excuses. It turns out that excuses are helpful, if we want to call it that, in terms of dealing with the issues of shame and incompetency. If you have an excuse, which in this particular case is, yes, I studied very hard, but alas, those aspects of the course assignments that I studied and emphasized were not the same as those emphasized in the test. Therefore, I did badly. And we have this reduction then in shame and a sense of incompetency because of that excuse. The same goes on here. We're at low effort. The amount of incompetency and shame here drops somewhat when it turns out that your excuse is illness. Now, here's the rub. This was half of the experiment. The other half had the same students in a counterbalanced way rate what they thought would be their instructor's sense of disappointment with those performances, or more broadly, punishment. And these kinds of disaffections on the part of faculty can carry themselves out in a lot of subtle ways, obviously one of them being that the individual is not given the benefit of the doubt at the end of the course for not having tried hard. So what we have here is a mismatch between instructors and students and what their objectives are. The students attempting to maintain a sense of competency on the one hand, but they are being affected very directly by teacher displeasure. So we have the least amount of displeasure by teachers under those circumstances where students are experiencing the greatest degree of shame and sense of worthlessness. Contrary, the greatest amount of teacher displeasure occurs in those cases where there is a considerable reduction in students' sense of worthlessness. And of course, these excuses, are a kind of full-service provider because they both reduce teacher degrees of punishment or disappointment, and they also minimize the sense of shame coming from a feeling of incompetency. And here is the maximal context in which that takes place, which led me to note the following. Thus, there emerges from this complex interplay among students and teachers a winning formula, in quotes, in the anticipation of failure that is designed to avoid personal humiliation and shame on the one hand and to minimize teacher punishment on the other. Try, or at least appear to try, but not too energetically and with excuses handy. It is difficult to imagine a strategy better calculated to sabotage the pursuit of personal excellence. These data have been replicated with real teachers up and down the school levels, down into the primary grades, including faculty here at the university. And it turns out that teachers at all these levels value effort. And so there's a certain amount of solid process evidence here that we can bank on. And how do we make use of that? Because here we are trying to foster creative and productive thinking and the will to learn. And yet all we're doing is running into obstacles. Indeed, the value of self-worth theory here is that it points out, it identifies those choke points where there are difficulties, the obstacles to the kinds of goals that we have in mind. And the first of these is that the first casualty of a fear of failure are those very values that we're trying to inculcate. Second, and then to say we must at that point consider the possibility of somehow moderating the fear of failure if we're to succeed. Also, number two, there's a situation in which effort is a threat. Try hard and fail anyway implies low ability. So to the extent that's true, how is it that we will be able to encourage and promote effort in classrooms if those are the wages that must be considered to be paid for effort? And then also, three, teachers need not worry always so much about a lack of motivation, but rather students being overly motivated to avoid failure. So how do we make a shift in that balance between the fear of failure and avoidance of failure and a different formula somehow toward the love of learning? So that has to be addressed in some fashion. And then finally, this mismatch between faculty and students, effort and ability. And we'll see that that mismatch cuts even deeper as we go on. Okay, let's pause for a moment with a sidebar. From whence came the energy to create these kinds of studies and the many that followed over the years? Well, Rona hinted at that, and it is a graduate seminar that I taught every year for a number of years, focused on achievement motivation and related to the kinds of dynamics that we're now beginning to see, both those that illustrate some of the problems and difficulties in promoting positive, success-oriented reasons for learning, and those things that detract from it. Here's how it worked. In the fall semester, my students and I created and designed a study. As it turned out, many, many studies, but interrelated. And in the spring, we conducted the research following that study, and then we analyzed the data. Now, there was an ownership clause in which any student who'd had any work toward that particular research project could make use of that data in any way they wanted for whatever purposes. And that led to a cascade of books, book chapters, refereed journal articles, conference proceedings, dissertations, master's degree, and occasionally a senior honors thesis over a long period of time. The first book in the first year and a half of our time together was one co-authored by myself and Richard Beery, in which we anticipated many of the things that we'll be talking about here this afternoon, and happily still a classic in the field. Now, students were very excited to be in this course. And as part of this preparation, I solicited comments from students over the years to give me some sense for what was valuable for them, what they took away from these activities. And the thing that I'll share with you, the single thing that conveys it all so fully, is that there was always, in this sense of continuity and pride in what they were doing, would break out occasionally a good-natured argument among them as to which of them had been enrolled in the course the longest period of time, consecutively. And so far, the winner, Sonia Wiedenhoff, professor of psychology at Evergreen College, with 8 consecutive semesters. I don't think she met any of the other faculty during that time. From whence did the subjects come? Well, I mentioned ambition earlier, and we will certainly rein that in here now because we'll be talking from this point on only about the research we generated at the college level, leaving aside the work that we generated at the elementary through high school years for another time, except when it's appropriate to comment and underscore what happened here at the college level. The main source, a pool of subjects, and I need not call them that really at all because they became valued informants, indeed even colleagues, students in my introductory psychology course. They were so eager to participate in answering questions, dealing with interviews, because what we were interested in was exactly what was fascinating them about themselves and each other. And so this was a wonderful time together and over a number of years. Well, after this particular study that we just had a chance to look at, pessimistic in many regards, but sobering, what's next? Well, a number of studies, but the main one to follow was, I think, the one on all our minds, and that is, were all students snared by this PAW model? were they all somehow consigned to a colorless world of fear and failure? Hopefully not. Were there some other self-worth formulas that were better, that made far more sense? And in that question, we propose that probably there were two diametrically opposed groups: the failure avoiders, who we've already met, and at the other end of things, success-oriented individuals. And then we also suspected a combination of approach and avoidance, where there was, in fact, a conflict. And through a series of stepwise discriminant functions and other research techniques, we found three clusters of students. The first, not a surprise, failure-oriented. These were the poster children for the PAW model. They had tied their sense of worth and value to ability to an excessive extent, and at the same time worried and were concerned that they didn't have the ability to play that game well. Hence, all of the kinds of subterfuge and self-deception that we've been talking about. Success-oriented individuals really expressed much of what we were hoping to find and to cultivate. That is, the will to learn, a sense of wonder and amazement at the world, the caring for learning. And so these individuals had a different model, formula for worth. For them, worth meant learning, and ability was the handmaiden to learning. It made learning possible, but it was not the valued aspect in the outcome. So, ability, a resource, plastic, mobile, incremental through effort and experience. Something that we found occurring clear down into the first and second grade, as when one second grade youngster confided to me, if you study hard, your brain's going to get bigger. Perfect. But not so for the failure avoiders, who believed that ability was fixed, stable, didn't change. So what's the use of trying hard, which will put you further into jeopardy if you don't have the ability to make the difference? But the success-oriented people, who felt they had the capacity, effort was not the threat, because when they failed, they realized what they had to do was to improve their effort, to try harder and better. And so there was not that threat or that stigma attached. Now, what about that other group? Those people conflicted between success and failure. We call them overstrivers. These individuals took failure on head first. They avoided failure by succeeding. Now, a damaging defensive strategy, but often ended in high GPAs, as long as it lasted. These people, although they succeeded constantly, were always being troubled by their fears that they were not able enough to continue, because their goals were perfection. And here they were, tightrope walkers, balancing, ready to fall. And if you study hard, as they had to at some point, and then you fail, it's even worse. But they couldn't make use of failure with honor strategies, because that was not their purpose. It was only success. And so what did many of them do? They did what we call closet achieving. They would study hard, but in secret, down at the Berkeley Public Library, in the bowels of the dormitory, so that they would succeed because they had studied heroic, Herculean efforts, constant. Those are the people who announce the test one day, and from that moment on are studying until you have to rip the crib sheets from their hands in the exam. And so there they are. They have, on the other hand, in success, without having tried, of course, secretly, have absolutely unimpeachable evidence of brilliance. So are overstrivers. And these groups, as individual difference factors, played their way through all the research that we'd undertaken after that time. Now, we went on to study in order to get some sense for the kinds of motivational principles operating among so many of our students, a number of other studies. My election as president of the International Society for Test Anxiety Research heralded in a 5-year study of the consequences and the causes of test anxiety. And, not a surprise, our individual difference people had different mechanisms for anxiety and how it affected them. We studied the damaging effects of repeated failure for students and the slow loss of the plausibility of their explanations for failure. And then also the recovery in part for those students who actually had belated success after failures. And we studied the corrosive effects of competition on students. And putting that all together, just to leave ourselves in a rather pessimistic mood for the moment, I wrote, "The vision of school life conjured up by self-worth theories is disturbing, at least for many, and sometimes for a majority of students. All in all, and all too often, it appears that classrooms are in reality battlefields where the rules of engagement favor defensiveness, self-deception, and lackluster effort, all in an attempt to avoid denigration of one's worth." Another aspect of our research, obviously, that paralleled our understanding and coming to understand the consequences of motivational principles operating, was to ask, what about the current teaching practices? Do they accommodate to the positive aspects of what we're hoping to achieve, or do they simply exacerbate some of the problems that we are seeing here? And of course, the answer is yes. And so we began to study these effects as well, which was part of the funding that was provided under my stewardship of the Berkeley Presidential Chair for Undergraduate Education. Beyond a doubt, the one factor that had most to do with those kinds of battlefield comments, according to students and our evidence as well, was competitive grading policies. Now, our interviews with students made very clear that they were not objecting to being graded. They saw grades as credentialing and, in many cases, information. But what they did object to was how they were graded. And they held their greatest anger and loathing for what we've all come to know as grading on the curve, or they called grade rationing. And we are all familiar with it in its simplest form. At the end of a semester, an instructor will take the students one by one and add up all the points credit each of them got, and then rank order them from high to low, from the student who got the highest number of points to those who got the lowest. And then at some point in the distribution, traditionally, typically, about the 90th percentile, a cutting score occurs, and those people in the upper 10% receive A's, the next 10% B's. That's the general procedure, although those cutting scores can move around and the percentages can change considerably. Now, our research team began to wonder about that. What's wrong with this in theory? After all, people who do well ought to get better grades than those people who don't do as well. That makes good pedagogical sense. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was motivational in nature. That is, the implication, deserving or not, the policy is such that someone is going to fail. And so therein is the rub. What happens when that is the reality of the matter? Two things happen. Well, first of all, students scramble to study, not necessarily to learn, but to stay out of the bottom of the heap or move as close to the top of the heap as possible. Now, the problem with that is that everyone is scrambling, so that anyone's individual's efforts to move up in that distribution relative to other people is not likely to happen because they will stay at the same rank order level since everyone else is struggling. So that although everyone may be doing better, and indeed should all get better grades, still there'll be that rank ordering and that set of losses. The other thing is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to know how much more you have to struggle to get ahead of someone next to you. And they're wondering the same thing about you. So there's the treadmill of study, conflicted study, obviously, from what we've seen, such that students will tell us that they awaken in the night, looking out the window at the dormitories around in the other blocks, lights ablazing. They realize suddenly that while they've been awake or asleep, others have been studying and are getting ahead. And so they shake themselves awake and begin to study. Indeterminate sentencing, it's called, in prison. Here, you don't know how much longer you have to stay on good behavior or keep studying in order to be released. And so this is the cockpit in which all of these kinds of things that we've already been looking at occur. Cutthroat competition. Cutthroat in the sense that students report others ripping pages out of assigned reading in library work so that others can't have access to it. And the cottage industry of all of these strategies, procrastination being just the tip of the iceberg. What is animating this is fear. So let's hark back to the comments made earlier in terms of what we must deal with. Can we change or shift or moderate fear as the driving force to something else, such as hope, by changing the grading systems? So our team went to work, and they argued that that instructor we spoke of earlier, who has that rank order distribution, ought to look at that 90th percentile closely and look at what's behind it, the performances of students at that point. Were those performances actually worthy of an A? If so, then a simple change, only a simple change, is needed. And that is to specify that any student who achieves that level of performance or exceeds it should receive an A in an absolute sense, or what we call merit grading. And so we undertook that study, and we modified the introductory psychology course along those lines. So at the beginning of the course, my GSIs and I would get together, and under my supervision and oversight, we would go through and create a scoring norm with points for all of the activities that students would be undertaking that semester in terms of exercises, activities, tests, papers, and the like. There would be a great deal of discussion, as you might imagine, debate, but finally coming to some decision, point by point. And then we could add up all those points and find the perfect score for the whole course. And then in a kind of subtractive way, we would begin to ask ourselves an even more difficult question. How many points can students lose, and which points? Because we had weighted all of these scores to start with in terms of their importance to the goals of the course. How much, this is badly put, how much more poorly must they do short of perfection to still receive an A? What is an A in terms of the goals of the course? And after doing that, students would know how much they had to do in terms of points to get that A. Other things were introduced also. No one would get a grade lesser than the number of points that they received. None of this business of having people who outscored everybody else and skewed the norms and had to change things around, and you got a lower score than you thought you might have otherwise, and so on. And students saying for the first time, I never knew what you had to do to get an A. I always assumed you just had to outperform somebody else. And we evaluated that course afterwards, and subsequent ones as well. And here's the interesting point from a self-worth visage. And it is that there's a real danger here from self-worth points of view, because virtually every student evaluated this model as fair compared to a lot of other possibilities, including the more draconian grading on a curve. Now, if this is fair, all of those excuses of unfairness dried up or were less plausible and could not be as effective in convincing oneself or convincing your audience as to why one failed with honor. And so in theory, this kind of system, the merit-based system, would be more threatening than any of the others, which were rife with unfairness and had all kinds of opportunities for explanations that would sidestep the implications of failure. So what happened? What happened was that effort trumped unfairness. There was less fear of trying hard than there was under other systems. Why should that be? Because as students said, I did it myself. I wasn't competing with others or some vague kinds of standards. I was allowed to and encouraged to use my resources to work hard and not have to compete with other people. Of course there were failures, but these tended to then be followed by trying again harder. The quotes are wonderful in that regard. And so now we have one strategy for changing the meaning of effort, to go back to those challenges we've mentioned right at the beginning. Success is due to my efforts. I learned it myself, and I earned it myself. When you compete with yourself, it pushes you to do better and forces me to draw on my own resources in achieving my goals for the course. Now it's all up to me to do well. So we turned the corner. Here is one strategy that may be useful in putting together with others to move toward a rearrangement of classroom learning that might serve these positive reasons for learning much better than otherwise. There was an interesting postscript, however, to our first effort at using this kind of merit-based evaluation. About 2 months after the grades were recorded in the recorder's office, Jeff Keppel, then chair of our department, received a very courteous letter from the Dean of Social Sciences, politely inquiring about the 40% of A's that were received in Covington's Psych 1 course. Polite, of course. The real fear, naturally, and it's a reasonable one, is grade inflation. Getting a higher grade than is worthy of your performances. And so since Jeff was involved with this from the beginning, because I had shared it with him and several faculty members who oversaw some of the standards that we impose for an A and a B, Jeff wrote back with an explanation for what we had done. And I made a side bet with the dean, an experiment really, since we're all experimentalists. What would happen if we increased the demands on students for A's next time? So we really couldn't then accept as plausible grade inflation. In fact, we could make this so hard that nobody could pass the course. But one wants to be moderate. So we did just that. And the next time it was 45%. Now one has to stop, because when you get to a point, I think with Jacob and Rachel's daughter from the Old Testament, if you work just 7 years, then you get the prize, and if you have all the conditions laid out in the right ways, then, I mean, Jacob could have killed himself from overwork long before he got her hand in marriage. And the same thing would happen here. But we didn't hear from the dean again. But we went on to worry about what happens if too many people get A's and those who were not expected to get A's from overstrivers. What's their take on all of this? Will a lot of A's lose their value for evidence of brilliance and reputation of great intellectual savvy? And so what kinds of grades and on what basis can we move forward, even though more and more people succeed and properly succeed, without this diminution in the value of what is received? I won't go further than to say the key here that everyone agreed to as valid and useful as a basis for grading in this context was improvement, interestingly enough. Okay, so now moving toward the exits. We come to that point where, after having laid out all of these negative issues and concerns, it's our responsibility to come up with some viable, interesting, exportable ideas for rearranging classrooms around motivational principles. We've already seen one element, which we have used after that experimental period in Psych 1, the merit base. We've used it continually. But it's just not one strategy. We can't just use a bunch of teaching tips. You have to use something that is coordinated, that's balanced, that has a direction to it that makes a larger sense. And so to answer that question, our team came up with the basis of creating a theme within which all of these other concerns could play their part and be coordinated. And that is, not surprising to you, problem solving, harking way back to the beginning, almost 40 years earlier. But problem solving in a different way, what we came to call capstone tasks, a notion that we're all familiar with, that at the end of a semester, there is some overriding problem or issue that all students, familiar with from the beginning, take responsibility for solving or at least addressing. So what are the advantages of that? Very briefly, the idea of merit-based system and excellence fits nicely here because it's the nature of the problem that defines what's excellence, not winning over someone else. It's how much does this idea push forward solutions to a problem? A second issue, which we need now comment on, is that students complained over the years about courses sometimes being opaque, rudderless, to use a term, not clear in terms of continuity or where things are headed. And naturally, motivationally speaking, what's needed for students is to have a destination in mind, as much as possible, within limits, and a roadmap for how to get there. Now, syllabi are intended to take up this issue and solve it, but we find that quite often the abstractions that start out as goals in these syllabi remain that, abstractions. And the justifications for the various activities that are undertaken to achieve those goals are not always clear, so that students find themselves doing things that they feel are in isolation one from another, disconnected activities that don't have a specificity about where things head or go from here. With a capstone course, the early warning is right there from the beginning. Indeed, the curriculum is a function of those tasks because the kinds of scaffolding needed for skill training become clear. And when that training has to take place, when those skills are introduced, and to what degree they must be mastered, all depend on the problem or task at hand. Hopefully those tasks, as we've argued, are ones that are of professional interest to the instructor as well, so that no longer are you always cut off from where you're headed. In fact, students are required to create the strategies and the planning as they go, sometimes reverse course, sometimes drop things out, try again, but under the tutelage of the instructor. The other point to be made, one that is addressed by the capstone notion, and that is that most of the students we have interviewed, mostly beginning students, freshmen, believe that their goal as learners is to absorb information. We know about the sponge, and you wring it out at test time. Now, this kind of mindset may have worked well in high school, but it does not work well in college, where students over and over again have said in one way or another, usually a three-worder, college is different. It's different because faculty, unanimously faculty, and their view of what they are doing here with regard to education is to promote independent thinking, the creation of students who are able to become meaning makers of these data on their own, by themselves. At the same time, students sometimes are very upset and troubled by the fact that faculty do not give them the kind of support and nurturing that they had in high school. Probably because, for better or worse, most faculty believe that freedom and trial and error are the best ways, within reason again, to teach for independent thinking. So a mismatch, another one, beside effort and ability, with the idea of capstone tasks from the beginning, with students having taken responsibility for a significant kind of problem, often valued by the instructor, and having that responsibility to work towards solutions gives a chance then for the persons to become active, be engaged in learning, rather than being passive. And because it often is what the instructor is interested in, then there is a shift from being the novice with a slightly pejorative set of terms to being mentors to students who are now apprentices. And that is one of the potential strategy advantages of the capstone tasks. Well, in the past 5 years or so, we have taken 3 courses, 3 directions of effort to begin to pull together the basis for some kind of policy judgments and policy statements about all of this work. At the elementary level, you're creating tasks, capstone tasks, which we call serious games. At the college level, using my intro psych course, we're using capstone tasks there. Probably have the most interesting of those and popular is one called the fantasy child. Every student in the course creates a fantasy family constellation, many different constellations. One child of which is a youngster who actually personifies a series of developmental crises, one every 2 weeks. And these must be dealt with, solved to the extent they can, through readings, through lectures, through individual work with one another. And we've had great fun with that. How do you get a 290-pound, 6'6" Cal football linebacker to take seriously his fantasy child? Enough so that they pay close attention to the principles involved and actually get involved. Well, you give him a football in a blanket, and it's his baby. And he carries it around through the entire section meeting. Just like real dads, or dads-to-be, happen in those wonderful courses for child rearing. The final capstone step is that the students create a public health brochure in which they list and talk about and justify child rearing practices that are positive based on all of the experience they've had in this course. And thirdly, we're interested in seeing how far this capstone notion can be taken and tried out, its limitations identified, its virtues magnified, by having graduate students create these courses. And that, in closing, is the most recent thing that we have been doing. And that involves 2 colleagues. One, Linda Van Hoene, who's director of the GSI Teaching and Resource Center here on campus, and Nick Vogt, originally a PhD student of mine, who now is the director of Student Learning Center at Princeton. We've created a graduate course in which we teach students about the capstone task, about problem solving, and from a point of view of self-worth theory. Their task, as I've implied, is to create one of their own courses that they believe they will be teaching in their first year on the job. We invite advanced graduate students within a year of their PhD, and again, within a year of going on the job market, from any of the various L&S departments on campus. And as Rona said, 36 L&S departments have been represented so far, along with graduate programs, all the way from ancient Roman archaeology to nuclear physics to 14th century Portuguese poetry. Sometime we'll talk about that marvelous mix of people, all of them finding that basically teaching is the same for everyone, and there are just slight variations called subject matter around the edges. There's a mock job interview at the end of the term in which everyone takes on the role of faculty inquisitors for people who are attempting to join the faculty, and they are queried about the course that they've designed and are required to talk about the rationale from a motivational point of view. And we've got some very sophisticated folks and pleasingly a lot of very good placements. The evaluations, to end things, of that particular program is interesting because it tends to validate what we thought so long ago, 40 years earlier, that it would be important to look at the motivational aspects of learning in addition to the academic and the content side of learning. And so here's a quote. Thinking about teaching for motivation has been the most challenging task I've undertaken in my graduate school career. I now feel very optimistic about a teaching career and very motivated too. And what about the choice of self-worth theory as introducing and investigating all of these dynamics we've talked about and presenting these to individuals to make use of in their teaching? Thinking about the fears of instructors and students has demystified the instructor-student relationship for me. Another, I'm more understanding of my students and their strange behavior patterns now because I have a framework for understanding why they may act the way they do. So Linda and I and Nick are in the final throes of preparing a book manuscript for my publishers, Cambridge University Press, that will cover the kinds of things that we've been talking about here in the latter part of this course. Now, in closing for the third time, I must tell you of a marvelous remark that Betty, my wife, made to me yesterday. She said, "Never in your whole life have you ever gone to work. You only go to Cal, to your students, to your research, your teaching, and to faculty meetings." And she was right. I've been the most lucky individual in the world and had no sense for that 53 years ago, sitting 200 yards from here. And that's because of the sense of community and largely an organizational community, the university, but particularly our department. Not too many decades ago, it was the case that academic psychology was quite parochial in terms of what counted as research topics for psychologists in research contexts. But not here. That was Berkeley's strength. I was welcomed. I was nurtured. I was supported. Now, not only, of course, was I supported and not let down, but I was not let off either. Because education comes from a different place. There are different methodologies for inquiry, different emphases on verification, and how careful that verification has to be, and through mentoring and other means not to be mentioned here of a more pointed nature, I was led, rightly so, into the mainstream of scientific psychology so that these ideas could be more forcefully put forward, publicly understood. And so it was like taking something that you love, and we all love learning, something mysterious and distant and extremely complicated, and metaphorically speaking, like a lover caressing it, yet like an anatomist taking it apart, joint by joint, sinew by sinew, to understand its essence, and then putting it back together again with its original beauty. That's what I have seen happen here, and to have been a small part of that, I appreciate it. Not only to those of you here, but those of you no longer here. Thank you.
So we're going to have a reception in a few minutes, but we could take a few questions from Artie before we do that. I had the microphone, so if you hold your hand up, I could bring it to you.
Let's see.
Perhaps you've touched on this in an extremely rich, very rich lecture, for which I congratulate you. But I'm interested in knowing how you go beyond imparting knowledge to imparting understanding. Understanding being, for me, going beyond the information given, going beyond knowledge to something that analogically is linked to something else. We know so little about analogy. So I was just wondering how you proceed to go from knowledge to understanding in the course of interacting with your students.
Let me see if I can reiterate that and get the essence of your question. Understanding what, of my students, or understanding that they would eventually have? Pardon?
The content of whatever it is that is being covered in the course. Whether it's 14th century Portuguese poetry or 22nd century atomic energy.
Well, our purpose there was to take advantage of the richness of all of these individuals with regard to their experiences. And almost invariably what would be found was that there was a communality among all of these groups, not only in terms of the kinds of issues they faced and problems, but also the kinds of solutions that they came up with, and they shared solutions. And these had a great deal of traction, a great deal of transfer effect for virtually any kind of situation, irrespective of the content that they were trying to teach. In fact, that was one of the things that came through most forcefully in the evaluations. That people said, I've learned so much from people I've never met and will never meet again, unfortunately, because of this richness and this underlying sense that there are some verities about teaching and learning that transcend all content. Joe, does that help? Excellent. Good place to do that. Al, yes.
This may be, Al, I thank you. I don't need a microphone.
The video.
Can you hear
folks,
me
though.
back there, Ethel? The video. What? Video. Oh, the video. Then I can sit down again. The question I had is really quite similar to Joe's, I think, in a way. I was sitting here trying to imagine teaching an introductory psychology course that ends with this capstone experience. I don't know whether that's possible or not, or whether, in fact, that's what you actually did. But it seems to me that an introductory course has so many different facets that where they have to learn certain things. how do you get from these various facets of an introductory course to a capstone experience that uses all of them?
Ah, okay.
Is that a question?
It's basically an answer. So, what I did not emphasize, obviously, given time that we had, was that there are certain things that students must learn in terms of facts, of principles, detail, before they can understand, before they can actually come up with solutions. And so we had periodic tests in which vocabulary tests, that sort of thing. We had written assignments. In one of these crises, in the area of memory, the memory chapter in the book, the child remembered something that never happened and was adamant that it had happened. And so students were then, in a testing situation, required to start things off by being able to define a lot of information about forgetting and about memory, and about causes of memory loss, so that they were all ready to create explanations for this kind of event. In fact, this one moved on to a chapter on mental illness. That is, to what extent is this an illness, or is this simply a developmental issue that has emerged? And other evidence in the story would lead students one way or another, with great debates. So there was a rich underpinning of, I think, what we'd call content and the use of content in order to deal with these particular problems, and creating eventually then insight and understanding. Is that?
Yeah, I think it raises too many questions for me. I'm imagining a course of 1,000 students, and how do you break them up into groups? Do they work as groups all the way through the course?
Right. Well, our job's a lot easier because it's only 500 at a time. But you're coming up with the answer too, spontaneously. Sometimes they're groups, sometimes they're individuals, sometimes they work in tandem as individuals and groups. But there's always a way to assess each student individually as well, and getting away from these kinds of situations where students piggyback on others. That's always a constant problem. But when that gets solved, my experience is the best kind of learning is when they do it together for certain kinds of learning. In fact, I think good teaching is defined by what students talk about in the dormitories, when they don't have to be talking in a formal way about classes. They can be talking about those fantasy children and what ideas they came up with, and argue about those kinds of things.
Marty, when I've talked to GSIs that you've mentored throughout the years, what they talk about a lot is your relationship with them and how that guides and motivates them. Can you talk about how the relationship between the teacher and the students fits into your motivational theory? It seems to me it would.
Certainly at the graduate level in this course, we're all familiar with that kind of relationship, close collegial relationship of trust. With regard to having large numbers of students who remain at some level ciphers for the instructor, I think those relationships get set by the structure of the course and of the kinds of requirements and demands. Perhaps one of the most effective of these, as I was mentioning before, when possible, if some of the issues that the instructor is concerned with professionally or personally interested in, conveys that to students to work on together. The implication is to the student, I'm being trusted enough by somebody who believes in something they're doing that I feel that I can produce in ways I couldn't otherwise, and I feel honored. So that would be an example of how you can do that in groups of people you probably only recognize years later when they come by and say, oh, I had your course, and I'll never forget something you said. For the life, you can't remember what it was, right?
I'm going to take the last question, and it's going to be looking for advice from you, and that is, I know that at least half the psychology classes, the average grade now is an A,
Yes.
if not higher. And so what's your advice to us to be thinking about with that, especially in terms of motivation?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I like the good old days. Yeah, I knew that you would pick up with my smile about 40% because, but that was unheard of back 2 decades ago. And advice?
Are we doing a injustice to our students if the numbers are up to 50, 60, 70% in some classes?
Yeah. Well, of course, theoretically, our mission as universities is to promote the best in every student. And if that's what it is, then so be it. But there are fallouts from that. You're absolutely right. And one of them we mentioned briefly, and that is what's the effect on people who would be in the A range anyway, no matter what kinds of requirements were? And do they have resentment toward those who, for some, what they might consider artificial reasons, but defensible, do as well as they do in terms of grades? So that's where I see much of the problem. I don't see much of a problem for outside business and industry, assuming that universities will be bargain basement methods for separating students. That's something they should do. They should only know that these people came from Berkeley, and they all did very well. And I know I'm touching on only a couple of the kinds of concerns that we have for that.
All right, well, thank you very much, Trevor.
Thanks.